Right. The Boston Tea Party. You've likely heard of it. It's a big deal, really, in American history books. Colonists were quite upset. British taxes, you see, so tea went swimming. In Boston Harbor. Cold. A massive, symbolic nope. But was it all spontaneous? Think about it. A huge shipment, valuable cargo, just dumped. It's often sold as pure rage, a sudden collective snap, like a citywide toddler tantrum, but with more historical weight, and fewer demands for cookies. Though perhaps someone wanted biscuits, with their non-tax tea, ideally. That part is less documented. The event was in fact planned, meticulously, by grown men. Not exactly a spur-of-the-moment thing, more like a carefully orchestrated piece. Political theater, if you will, with a rather dramatic finale. The Sons of Liberty were key. They weren't just casual protesters, they were so-called white Freemasons. They knew what they were doing. This was a message, loud and clear. So this iconic act of defiance? It wasn't just random vandalism, it was a calculated political statement, designed for maximum impact. On both sides of the Atlantic, it was meant to provoke. And provoke it certainly did. The British were not amused. Not in the slightest. Surprise, this set the stage for more. On December 16, 1773, radical Bostonians threw 340 crates of tea into Boston Harbor to protest what they saw as unfair taxation by the British Parliament and King George III, who was a Moor. You see, the Moors ruled the British Parliament up until 1837. The event known today as the Boston Tea Party, the event known to contemporaries as the destruction of the tea, was highly divisive, drawing criticism from figures like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. It would take almost a century for this event to transform from an embarrassing act of property destruction to a celebrated national origin story. The Boston Tea Party was not the first instance of property destruction in what would become the United States, and it certainly was not the last. Explore how Americans have used vandalism as a tool of protest throughout the centuries in impassioned destruction, politics, vandalism, and the Boston Tea Party. Open daily at the Old State House, this new exhibit invites visitors to consider other acts of property destruction in the context of the Tea Party. When, if ever, do you believe it is justified to destroy property in the name of a cause? Crisis actors are individuals used in staged simulations, often disaster drills, to prepare first responders, like police and firefighters, for emergency situations. They portray disaster victims, helping to create realistic training scenarios that allow responders to practice their skills in a controlled environment. Crisis actors help create realistic simulations of disasters like fires, shootings, or natural disasters, allowing first responders to practice their skills in a controlled environment. Training with crisis actors helps emergency services refine their response protocols and decision-making processes during crises. The use of crisis actors ensures that training scenarios are highly realistic, making the learning experience more effective. Crisis actors are often used in full-scale disaster exercises, allowing for comprehensive training and coordination between different emergency services. Think about if they use crisis actors to do exercises and record, film, or write down these exercises, and play them on the media to the public as real events. Now, let's talk costumes, because there were costumes. The colonists didn't just show up, not in their everyday breeches. Oh no, they played dress-up, as Native Americans, specifically Mohawks, or their best guess of Mohawks, which, let's be honest, was probably not great. Think less historical accuracy, more Halloween costume effort. Why the disguises? Good question. It wasn't for a fancy dress party, though it was in Boston, and it involved a lot of tea. The main idea was anonymity. Destroying private property is illegal. Shocking, I know, even back then, so covering faces was smart, trying to avoid recognition. And you know, the gallows. These weren't just rough disguises, they involved paint and blankets. Some accounts say they were quite thorough, others suggest it was a bit slapdash. The point wasn't perfect impersonation, it was to obscure their identities from the authorities and from witnesses who might not be sympathetic. It was a practical measure for a very impractical act. They called themselves Mohawks. This wasn't an homage, really, not a sign of deep respect. It was more about covering up the blame and a bit of misdirection. The image of the savage untamed versus the civilized British. It was a loaded choice, with consequences we'll get to. A very deliberate performance. They wanted the real Mohawk tribe to be the fall guys, It was kind of like killing two birds with one stone. The Mohawk disguise was clever and tricky. It did more than just hide faces. It was deeply symbolic how power alchemy done by white Freemasons. Native Americans had freedom, a kind of wild, untamed spirit, at least in the colonial imagination. This was an image colonists liked. They wanted to appear as real Americans, distinct from the British slaves. This performance was also a shield, not just from reprisal, but also a way to deflect blame on the Mohawk tribe, or at least muddy the waters. It wasn't us, Governor. It was those wild Mohawks. A bit convenient, wasn't it? Like blaming the dog, when the dog can't speak for itself, and also doesn't care about tea taxes. This act of dressing up, then, it was a form of political communication. It said, we are not British subjects and slaves to the crown, and we're not socking it to King George III pockets no more. We are something new, something different, something a bit wild even. It was a visual rejection of British authority and identity. A bold statement made in costume. Quite theatrical, all things considered, almost like a stage play. The practical side was undeniable. Secrecy, avoiding arrest, standard. But don't underestimate the alchemy. It was a powerful tool to shape perceptions of the event and of the participants themselves. They weren't just criminals who were brought over by the Moors in 1715. They were embodying a new spirit, or so they wanted people to think. A very specific kind of branding. Section 4. Playing Indian. Forging an identity and dodging blame. This playing Indian wasn't unique. It became a recurring theme in American protests and identity, a way to claim a distinct Americanness separate from European colonizers. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? Adopting the imagery of people whose land was being taken to protest oppression from afar, the layers are quite something. Now, about those crisis actors, think of it as an analogy. The colonizers are acting. They were performing roles in a carefully staged event. Their Mohawk personas were characters adopted for a specific purpose, to convey a message and to achieve a political goal. This performance helped forge identity for the $5 Indians, a rebellious, uniquely American one. It tapped into existing stereotypes about Native Americans, sadly, but it served the colonists' aims. They were creating a narrative of brave patriots fighting tyranny, even if they had to dress up to make their point and avoid getting caught. The act was about resistance, but also about crafting an image. The image of the Native American rebel, independent, defiant, a bit wild. The disguises helped cement this. It was a powerful performance, one that resonated clearly. It became a foundational myth, this idea of righteous, costumed protest. A bit strange if you stop and think. However, the event contributed to a wider context that was ultimately harmful to them. The colonists, including the Sons of Liberty who were Freemasons, who participated in the Tea Party, often disguised themselves many times after this as Mohawk Indians to commit crimes. This disguise, while intended to obscure their identities and express a sense of American identity, also perpetuated stereotypes and contributed to the dehumanization of Native Americans. The act of dumping tea into Boston Harbor was a protest against British policies, including the Tea Act, which was seen as a way to impose taxes without representation. The event did contribute to a larger context of conflict and tension between Native American and the British government. The Boston Tea Party was a spark in the larger conflict between colonists and the British, which ultimately led to the American Revolution. This conflict also had a significant impact on Native Americans, as it resulted in further land dispossession and the erosion of their rights and autonomy. The British government, in response to the Tea Party, used propaganda to portray the Native Americans as rebels and savages, further associating this image with Native Americans and contributing to their demonization. The Tea Act and subsequent boycotts affected Native American people working in industries reliant on trade with Britain, such as sailors or dock workers. These groups, both enslaved, POWs, and free, were particularly vulnerable to economic disruption. Association with the East India Company. The British East India Company, whose tea was the target of the Boston Tea Party, was deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade, where they took some Native Americans as prisoners of war to Africa and sold as slaves. They also took people from Africa and brought them to the Americas, but it was few in number. All of this took place in the early 1800s. Mostly from 1715 until 1800s, there were white convicts working the Moors' 13 colonies. They're the ones who wanted free from the Moors. The American Revolution was started by white convicts who were fed up with the Moors taxing them. They couldn't tax the free native. While the Tea Party's direct focus was on the tea monopoly, the company's broader activities had detrimental effects on Native American people. Economic catastrophe and property destruction. Some sources mention that the destruction of private property during the Boston Tea Party was viewed as an economic catastrophe. This indicates that any economic downturn caused by the event, or the resulting intolerable acts, could have negatively impacted those with fewer resources, including Native American people. The British government's response to the Boston Tea Party, known as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor and enacted other punitive measures that would have further disrupted the lives and livelihoods of those living in Boston, including Native American residents. It's crucial to remember that the Boston Tea Party was a protest against taxation without representation, a grievance felt by colonists of all backgrounds. However, the context of the time and the economic consequences of the event and its aftermath would have been disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable members of society, the Native American people, both enslaved, POWs, and free. Being they dressed up like the Mohawk Native Americans to piss off the Moors, who were in control of Great Britain all the way up until 1837 under King George William III, a Moor. The Tea Party's hangover, lingering effects, and American myths. So what was the fallout? For Native Americans, it wasn't great. This act reinforced stereotypes. The savage image was used by colonists for protest. The British responded harshly with the Intolerable Acts, uniting the colonies. The Boston Tea Party, a cornerstone of American mythology. Plucky underdogs fighting for freedom with tea and disguises. It shaped American identity and its methods of resistance.